Cypher here. A little while ago, Mr. Beat and I created this series, and we were talking about the states that we currently live in. So I figured with the second batch, we'd go further. For those who don't remember, we started this series as a way of talking about how state rivalries have a historical basis. He did his on Missouri versus Kansas, which is a fairly equal rivalry, whereas I did mine on New Mexico versus Texas, which is extremely unequal. And today, he's also going to be doing a fairly equal rivalry, which is Michigan versus Ohio, but that's not violent enough for me. I lived in what's often called the battle-born state for 2 decades, and yet West Virginia is actually more deserving of that title. They had to fight for their independence in a way that no other state ever has, and they continued to be a rough-and-tumble state for decades to come. Unlike last time, I'm going into fairly unfamiliar territory. I can't honestly say if there's still a rivalry going on between West Virginia and Virginia, or any other state for that matter, but I can point to certain sports rivalries. I don't really care about sports, but a lot of Americans do.
I'm just making conversation. Come on! Football!
Plus it allows me to talk about the historical conflict between these two states. There's some other ones, but they're not really historically important. So let's look at the root of the rivalry between West Virginia and Virginia, and why there even is a West Virginia. West Virginia began as part of Virginia. It was a weird backwoods area in the Western Mountains. Eastern Virginia is fairly flat until the Appalachian Mountains, but what is now West Virginia is all mountains. Before the American Revolution, the territory was officially cut off from colonial expansion by the Proclamation of 1763. This was an attempt by King George III at protecting American Indians from further frontier violence that might cause another disastrous war like the 7 Years' War and subsequent rebellion led by Pontiac. Today's border is roughly where the proclamation line ran. Understandably, Virginians didn't like being told they couldn't go where they had just fought a war to go. In America, we called the 7 Years' War the French and Indian War, and it was basically fought to gain access to the Ohio Territory. In fact, it was began by an uppity Virginian no one has ever heard of.
Who's that Pokemon?
George Washington. But the king said no, and everybody followed his proclamation. Nah, people didn't give a damn. And they just started going into the Alleghenies like it was 1752 again.
Then tonight we're gonna party like it's 1699.
There had been some modest developments in what was called Orange County before the French and Indian War, but nothing of substance. Despite the proclamation line, people just kept going. Quickly, Virginia had to establish another Appalachian county called Kentucky during the Revolutionary War. The weird thing is that these folks felt independent of Virginia already. They were so far away from the government that they petitioned for statehood. An inland county called Vandalia had been proposed, but to no effect. Then there was West Sylvania, which was proposed in 1782, and failed. Kentucky got it, but Western Virginia was stuck there for decades. They continued to be a very different area from the rest of Virginia. Slavery was never a major force in the Appalachian Mountains. In what became West Virginia, by 1850 only 7% of the population were slaves, as opposed to over 30% in what is now plain old Virginia. So there was a cultural, economic, and geographic divide between these areas of the state. But it took the Civil War to really bring these discrepancies to violence. Well, except for Harper's Ferry, where John Brown's raiding party attacked a West Virginia arsenal to ignite a race war, but failed miserably. No, it was Virginia's vote in April of 1861 to secede from the Union that made West Virginia go,
Screw you guys, I'm going home.
2 months later, a bunch of Unionists got together in Wheeling and declared a rival government called the Restored Government of Virginia. Wait. Hold on. That's the presiding officer's face. I mean, look at that guy. He looks like he was holding in a fart for that photo. What the hell? In the second meeting of this convention, one of the attendees by the name of Dennis Dorsey said, "I deem that the separation of Western Virginia from Eastern is the paramount object in the minds of Western Virginians." They approved the creation of a new state in October of 1861 called Kanawha, but they quickly changed the name to West Virginia. Part of their constitution called for the gradual emancipation of all slaves within the state, but the 13th Amendment hastened that only 3 years later. They had to organize and reorganize, but the Union accepted West Virginia as her own state in December of 1862. In a sense, West Virginia had seceded from Virginia to join the Union after Virginia had seceded from that very Union. It's secession inception, man! Seems like pretty straightforward bureaucratic stuff, right? But that masks the fighting that was taking place. It is not as though every county in West Virginia was completely against secession. Many citizens were fierce Confederates. Heck, Stonewall Jackson was a West Virginian. The Confederate Congress even seated representatives of Western Virginia. Plus, the Union side was a bit confused, since many units from West Virginia were simply labeled Virginian. Sovereignty claims must always be backed by force, and West Virginia was a hard-fought battle to attain. Throughout the Civil War, the Union mostly maintained control over West Virginia. It was conquered quickly in 1861, but guerrilla fighting was constant. The Confederates sent 2 expeditions into the territory. There were also some campaigns that happened to touch West Virginia, such as fighting along the Shenandoah, and even as far as Harper's Ferry being taken multiple times. But the war ended, West Virginia won her independence from Virginia, and everything was solved, right? Nothing ends that easily. We've got Reconstruction to worry about, and Virginia wanted her territory back. So they got into some legal battles, and I'll let the man who does Supreme Court briefs talk about that.
The Virginia-West Virginia rivalry is so unique, there is not one but 2 Supreme Court cases between the 2 states. The first one in 1871 called Virginia v. West Virginia, and the second one in 1911 called Virginia v. West Virginia. It's the same name, so let's see if I can not get the 2 mixed up here. The first case happened after the American Civil War ended. Virginia had argued that the way West Virginia broke away from Virginia was not legal. Virginia said the elections West Virginia had to see if they should break away or not were illegitimate. In fact, many of the counties didn't even get to vote, and Virginia wanted these counties back. So they sued. West Virginia argued that the Supreme Court lacked jurisdiction in this case. On March 6, 1871, the Supreme Court sided with West Virginia, saying a state legislature can't undo election results based on fraud, in which the governor controls how elections within the state are carried out. Quote, "The act of Congress admitting the state of West Virginia into the Union at the request of the Commonwealth of Virginia, with the provisions for the transfer of those counties in the Constitution of the new state and in the acts of Virginia legislature, is an implied consent to the agreement of those states on that subject." Unquote. In other words, Virginia let it happen during the war, and it was too late to change it. You snooze, you lose. So yeah, those counties stayed with West Virginia. But Virginia wasn't done yet. It said West Virginia owed them money. As Virginia had paid off its debts to the U.S. government, they argued West Virginia owed part of that, since some of that borrowed money benefited it when it was still part of Virginia. After trying to collect the money for decades, it finally went to the Supreme Court in January 1911. The court sided with Virginia in this case, saying West Virginia was bound by its own constitution to pay that back. West Virginia had to pay Virginia $12 million. But this rivalry isn't over yet. Back to you, Cypher.
Thanks, Mr. Beat. $12 million? That's gotta hurt. They also continued to squabble over the location of the border, which wasn't resolved until 1991. Seriously, that late. And because of recent economic problems in West Virginia, some counties have talked about seceding again just to join the more prosperous Virginia. There was even legislation introduced in 2011. so this is an ongoing issue. But I don't want to leave out another rivalry that I've actually done some prior work on. During the mining wars of West Virginia, Kentucky became a bit of a problem for the state. There had already been some cross-border fighting during the Hatfield-McCoy feud. Most of the Hatfields lived in what became Mingo County, West Virginia, and that animosity stuck around. During the fighting there in the early 1920s, which newspapers around the country called the Mingo War, strikebreakers would hide across the border, and Kentucky would give them refuge. There was a fight called the 3 Days Battle there, with straight-up shooting across one side to the other for days. Yeah, imagine Green Hills separated by a river, with people just shooting across.
In one of these here now cartoon pictures, a body can get away with anything.
And that is Kentucky versus West Virginia. Later it was said that, for 8 days after the battle, they were bringing dead men out of the woods. After mass arrests of mine workers in Mingo County, a bunch of Union members marched south from Kanawha County, but they ended up being halted in Logan County during the biggest internecine fight after the Civil War, called the Battle of Blair Mountain. I'd love to do an episode on the Mingo County War, since I wrote a term paper on it, but suffice it to say, it's a lot more complex than West Virginia versus Kentucky. Back then, for sure though, there was quite a bit of animosity between West Virginia and Kentucky. I can't tell if that still exists, but if you live in West Virginia, let me know. Too bad nobody talks about that during their sports rivalry today. There's a few other West Virginia rivalries, but they really have to do with their sports rather than any kind of history I'm interested in. The real interesting thing is when a state rivalry is founded in something, especially if it is violence. And it's pretty difficult to find one more violent than the rivalries of West Virginia. So I hate to keep on adding these addendums, but this video is currently demonetized. I've got a bunch of videos that are pending review, and this is one of them. And the last two videos didn't go through with the review. They actually remain demonetized, specifically the feminism video and Black Klansman. I really don't even know what could possibly have kept Black Klansman demonetized, so please consider buying a shirt or donating to my Patreon. This stuff is getting ridiculous. 3 videos in a row, and I'm still really pissed off about them demonetizing my veterans video. YouTube tries to say that they're trying to enforce advertiser friendliness, and through their guidelines they have clearly stated rules and all that kind of stuff. But in reality, they're willing to violate those at any given recourse and arbitrarily say what's advertiser friendly and what's not. They have no actual guidelines, that's just a front. For if they were following those guidelines, not a single one of these videos would be demonetized. So YouTube, if you're not willing to support difficult history, say so. Never, ever claim that you support education ever again, and sink back into the hole from whence you came. By the way, there is a new design in the store, coming straight from Tageek, so special thanks for making the art, Tageek. A link to both Teespring and his site are in the description.